Bon, let's begin. Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir et bienvenue au Mémorial de la Shoah qui s'invite une nouvelle fois chez vous dans l'attente d'être autorisé à rouvrir ses portes au public. Nous sommes très honorés et heureux d'accueillir ce soir les historiens Timothy Snyder et Christian Ingrao pour une conférence inaugurale d'un cycle de tables rondes sur l'année 1941, année décisive dans le sort des Juifs européens. Alors ce cycle, organisé en partenariat avec France Culture, propose de discuter avec un panel d'historiens des grands enjeux de l'année 1941 en balayant l'Europe d'est en ouest, avec une rencontre dès ce dimanche sur le tournant capital représenté par l'invasion allemande de l'Union soviétique en juin 1941, suivi de focus sur les principaux États dont les populations juives ont été décimées suite à l'opération Barbarossa, à savoir l'Ukraine, la Biélorussie et les pays baltes. Il s'agira également de voir ce qu'il se passe au même moment dans les pays d'Europe occidentale, avec la mise en place des administrations antisémites et les persécutions sociales et économiques. Mais dans un premier temps, nous avons donc souhaité donner carte blanche à l'historien américain Timothy Snyder pour une conférence inédite sur la question 1941. Timothy Snyder, vous êtes titulaire de la chaire Richard Levin à l'Université de Yale et membre permanent de l'Institut des sciences humaines de Vienne. Vous êtes l'auteur de nombreux ouvrages, dont le fameux Terre de sang, l'Europe entre Hitler et Staline, paru en anglais en 2010 aux éditions Basic Books. Cet ouvrage a rencontré un énorme succès public et critique. Il a été traduit en une vingtaine de langues. La traduction française a été assurée par Pierre-Emmanuel Dauzat en 2012 aux éditions Gallimard. Christian Ingrao en parlera sans doute beaucoup mieux que moi, mais disons que cet ouvrage a renouvelé l'historiographie de la période. Vous avez en effet adopté une approche territoriale couvrant une vaste entité géographique qui englobe aujourd'hui la Pologne, l'Ukraine, la Biélorussie, les États baltes et la Russie occidentale. Cette approche novatrice place au cœur du récit l'expérience vécue par l'ensemble des populations de ces territoires qui ont subi les politiques meurtrières mises en place par Staline et Hitler entre 1933 et 1945, ce qui vous a permis d'ancrer la destruction des Juifs dans le contexte global de ces massacres de masse. Dans le sillage de cet ouvrage, vous avez publié quelques années plus tard « Terre noire, l'Holocauste et pourquoi il peut se répéter », qui a également été traduit de l'anglais par Emmanuel Dauzat aux éditions Gallimard, ouvrage où vous revenez sur la genèse et le déroulement de l'extermination des Juifs. Alors, pour introduire et encadrer cette conférence inaugurale, nous avons donc le plaisir d'accueillir l'historien Christian Ingrao. Christian, vous êtes directeur de recherche au CNRS, vous enseignez à l'Université catholique de l'Ouest située à Angers. Vous êtes un grand spécialiste français du nazisme, des politiques d'occupation allemande en Europe de l'Est, également des phénomènes de la violence de guerre et de la Shoah. Parmi vos ouvrages, je citerai « Croire et détruire les intellectuels dans la machine de guerre SS », paru chez Fayard en 2010 et qui a également été traduit en plusieurs langues. Je citerai également « La promesse de l'Est », Espérance nazie et génocide 1939-1943, publié au Seuil en 2016. Enfin, votre dernier ouvrage, apparaître donc chez Odile Jacob en mars prochain et qui s'intitule « Le soleil noir du paroxysme, nazisme, violence de guerre, temps présent ». Alors, avant de céder la parole à nos invités, je vous explique en quelques mots, chers spectateurs, la manière dont vous allez pouvoir poser vos questions à nos invités à la fin donc, de la conférence de Timothy Snyder. Deux options, soit à l'oral, donc vous levez votre main et on ouvrira votre micro, soit par écrit Je vous demanderai, vous êtes très, très, très nombreux ce soir à nous suivre et nous sommes très contents, mais je vous demanderai donc d'utiliser l'outil Q et R, donc questions et réponses qui se trouve en bas de votre écran au lieu du chat. C'est plus simple de lister vos questions quand c'est par cet outil-là. D'avance, je vous remercie d'être concis dans vos remarques et questions parce que vous êtes très nombreux et de limiter vos propos au sujet qui nous occupe ce soir. Dernière petite chose, Timothy Snyder est francophone, mais par confort et facilité, il va s'exprimer dans sa langue maternelle, c'est-à-dire en anglais. Il y a donc une traduction simultanée de l'anglais vers le français qui est prévue. Si vous voulez suivre donc la conférence en français, il suffit d'aller sur l'onglet interprétation, donc en bas de votre écran, et de choisir le canal français. Et je vous informe donc que cette traduction n'est disponible que sur la plateforme Zoom et non sur Facebook, sur la chaîne YouTube du Mémorial et sur notre site. Christian, je vous passe donc la parole. On se retrouve d'ici 50 minutes pour vos questions. Je vous souhaite à toutes et tous une excellente soirée.
Merci Julie. Bonjour à tous. Je vais pas monopoliser la parole très longtemps. Hein. La conférence et l'invité, l'événement, c'est quand même la conférence de Tim Snyder. Simplement rappeler que Timothy Snyder est un historien qui est spécialiste de l'Europe centrale et orientale, qu'il est un des premiers historiens à avoir réellement, je dirais, les moyens de sa politique avec la maîtrise d'un nombre de langues extrêmement impressionnant. J'ai entendu Tim, je pense, en français, en anglais, peut-être en allemand, en polonais, c'est sûr, en biélorusse, en russe, etc., etc. Donc, c'est quelque chose qui est extrêmement impressionnant. Mais au-delà de ce phénomène linguistique, si vous voulez, c'est aussi quelque chose qui lui permet d'embrasser des univers documentaires qui, jusqu'à lui, restaient quand même malgré tout extrêmement étanches. Et c'est sans doute une des choses qui caractérise le mieux son parcours. C'est alors cette première vertu, il la combine aussi à une deuxième vertu. Il écrit énormément. Si vous regardez sa liste de publications sur, on va dire, les 22 dernières années, vous avez un livre à peu près un livre tous les 2 ans. Hein. Je ne sais pas exactement comment Tim fait pour écrire autant. Il a commencé par la biographie d'un penseur qui s'appelle Casimir Kelles-Krauss en 1998. Je vous passe la liste, mais il a montré aussi un esprit de synthèse extrêmement impressionnant en travaillant sur la reconstruction des nations, en faisant une espèce d'histoire croisée, si vous voulez, de la construction nationale de la Pologne, de l'Ukraine, de la Lituanie et de la Biélorussie entre le XVIe siècle et le XXe siècle, avant évidemment de montrer toute l'ampleur de son talent sur le XXe siècle. Alors aujourd'hui, ce qui va nous retenir, c'est évidemment cette année 1941. Et cette année 1941, Tim l'a abordé de front, de façon extrêmement intéressante, dans ce très beau livre qui s'appelle Terre de sang. Hein, encore une fois, je ne vais pas parler très longtemps, mais il me semble qu'il y a 3 choses extrêmement intéressantes dans Terre de sang. La première, c'est que Tim montre qu'il est à la fois l'historien des pratiques étatiques et en même temps de l'expérience des populations. 2 choses qui peuvent sembler extrêmement difficiles à mélanger. Par l'approche spatiale, Tim a réussi à donner un aperçu extrêmement convaincant, hein, une overview extrêmement convaincante de ce genre de choses. Hein. Et c'est vraiment quelque chose qui est très intéressant que de voir en fait comment l'approche spatiale lui permet de montrer la succession des violences qui s'opèrent entre les années 30 et les années 40, hein, et qui connaît bien sûr évidemment un point culminant avec la Grande Guerre patriotique, cette Grande Guerre patriotique qui commence le 22 juin 1941. Donc vous avez, comme je vous le disais, 3 points qui me semblent fondamentaux. Le premier, c'est qu'il s'agit d'une étude qui, en passant par l'espace, met en place l'interaction entre les politiques, qui, en passant par l'espace, c'est mon second point, permet d'approcher la multitude des expériences que font les populations et enfin permet malgré tout de montrer comment les pratiques étatiques qui se sont succédées sur ces terres de sang étaient des pratiques qui étaient à la fois de l'ordre de l'adaptatif et du réactionnel, en tout cas dans les univers que développaient les pouvoirs occupants de tout cela. C'est donc, j'espère, de tout cela qu'on va parler en fin de séance. Tim, je vais vous laisser la parole. You have the floor for 45 minutes, and many thanks for coming.
Okay. First of all, well, many thanks, Christian, for the kind introduction, and many thanks to La Mémoire de la Shoah for this invitation, and also for all the good work you have done over the years in bringing not just the Holocaust as a whole, but the origins of the Holocaust in 1941 into public discussion. I hope very much that we'll have a chance to continue our conference this evening in person when times are better. So I've been asked to speak about the year 1941. 80 years have passed since 1941. And as we begin this strange year, 2021, I want to begin by asking, why is this commemoration so awkward and difficult? Why is it not natural to commemorate the anniversary of 1941? It seems to me there are other years which we find easier to remember. We find it easier to remember 1933. I think 1933 is easier to identify with. A regime change, a burning parliament. These are events which are not so far away from our imagination. It's perhaps easier to remember 1939, especially if you're looking at the world from Poland and you want the world to remember that the war began in 1939 precisely. If you're looking at the world from France, then the year 1940 is unforgettable because it raises great national questions about the history of one's country. And of course, it's perhaps most comfortable to commemorate 1945, because this is the year that the war came to an end, and we can all agree that the war coming to an end was a good thing. But of course, as Christian and as Julie have suggested already, if we want to remember the Holocaust and understand the Holocaust, the year to remember and the year to understand is 1941. So let me very briefly make the case for why 1941 is so important, and then let me devote most of my time to an explanation of how we get to mass killing of Jews in 1941. So 1941 is the year to remember and to understand, because 1941 is the year when the Holocaust began. If the Holocaust means the deliberate mass murder of Jews, if the Holocaust means the mass murder of Jews with the explicit intention of eliminating all Jews, then it begins in 1941. 1941 is also important because it is the year when the Nazi imagination crystallizes around the final solution that we know. It crystallizes around the version of the final solution that we know. There were a number of other versions involving deportation to Madagascar, deportation to Siberia. Those were also final solutions. But the final solution that we know, mass murder, becomes the one which is implemented in 1941, and the other ones are forgotten. Third, the year 1941 is essential because the year 1941 is the year when Germans realized that they could kill large numbers of civilians, in particular, large numbers of Jews. When we look at this from retrospect, it seems natural that this was possible, but in the beginning of 1941, Germans were not aware that mass murder on the scale of thousands and then tens of thousands was possible, and that it was possible for them. This is something that they learned in that year. Relatedly, 1941 is also the year when the technology of mass murder was discovered. Now, when I say the word technology, you're probably thinking of the gas chambers. The gas chambers were invented earlier. They were used for the handicapped. They become important in the Holocaust later in 1942, 1943, 1944. But the technology, which is actually decisive for the Holocaust, is the technology of lining people up in front of death pits and shooting them. It's the technology of execution by firing squad. It's the social organization of mass murder face to face. That's the technology which is discovered in 1941. And it's the most important technology of the Holocaust. It kills as many Jews as gas does, but it's more important than gas because it comes first and because it's the technology which teaches the Germans that this is all possible. The next reason why it's worth remembering 1941 is that this is the year when the scale of murder changes. So of course there are murders of Jews in the 1930s on the scale of hundreds. In the winter of 1940, Jews are dying in ghettos on the scale of tens of thousands. But it's not until 1941 where until we're talking about the scale of hundreds of thousands, or by the end of the year, 1 million. Or to put it into perspective, more Jews were murdered in 1919 in Europe than were murdered in 1940. It's only when you get to the year 1941 when you have a decisive qualitative break into something which is clearly new. Finally, 1941 is important because it's during the year 1941 when the German leadership, and indeed Hitler personally, makes it clear that the goal is the complete extermination of the Jewish people, that this is a political goal and that this is a goal to be achieved during the war. The ideology was no secret, of course, but the idea that all of the Jews were to be murdered is something which comes clear to German leaders in the late parts of 1941. All right, so having tried to establish why it's so worthwhile to remember 1941, and by the way, why this initiative from the Memorial de la Shoah is so important, let me now try to explain, make an argument about how we get to 1941. What are the causes of 1941? But before I do that, let me give you an image of 1941, which is less abstract. I've just talked about 1941 and all the reasons why we know now that it's so important. But before I go into the argument, let me give you a more specific image, a more concrete image of 1941. To me, the most striking and maybe historically the most important moment in the history of the Holocaust, and certainly in the history of the Holocaust that year, is August 26th to August 27th, 1941, when about 23,600 Jews are murdered in an improvised way over pits near Kamyanets-Podilsky in what's now Western Ukraine. 23,600 human beings were shot. There had never been a mass murder like this before, not in the history of the Holocaust, not, I don't think, in history. I don't think was ever the case that so many civilians were shot at one time. And of course, this mass murder at Kamyanets-Podilsky is the template for the better organized but very similar mass murder in Kiev a month later, on the 28th of September, 1941, when about 34,000 Jews are murdered over the course of a day and a half in a pit which is remembered as Babi Yar, the same method by way of bullets. This is what the second half of 1941 was like. At Riga on November 28th and December 8th, some 28,000 Jews were murdered. In Minsk and around Minsk in late 1941, early 1942, similar numbers of Jews were murdered. These are some of the most prominent sites, but as historians and as many of you I'm sure will know, there were hundreds of such killings on the territory of the Western Soviet Union in 1941. Hundreds of places. Hundreds of places where hundreds of thousands, and by the end of 1941, about 1 million Jews were murdered. So let's note some basic things about these images. We are very far from Germany. The mass murder of Jews does not begin in Germany. It begins far from Germany. It begins in the Western Soviet Union. The Jews who are being murdered are Soviet Jews, but we have to make a couple of qualifications right away. The first qualification is that these lands in the Western Soviet Union, many of them, the Baltic states, Eastern Poland, had only been part of the Soviet Union for about 2 years, for a little bit less than 2 years. And the second interesting and important qualification we have to make is that some of the Jews who were killed in the Western Soviet Union were from very far away. Some of them were from Hungary, some of them were from Germany, some of them were from Austria. And there's something interesting to notice here, and that is that Austrian and German Jews were victims of the Holocaust in the end. They weren't major victim groups, but when they were killed, they weren't killed in Austria or Germany. If they were murdered, it's almost certain that they were murdered far away from home, in places like Minsk or in places like Riga, which only makes the year 1941 and the place, the Western Soviet Union, more important. And it only gives us more to explain, because when we think of the Holocaust, we think of Berlin, we think of Vienna. But if Jews from Berlin or Vienna were going to be murdered, they were going to be murdered somewhere further east. They're going to be taken away from home first. So we have a time. The time is 1941. We have a place, and the place is the Western Soviet Union. And we have some idea of the victims. And this is worth stressing again. The victims of the Holocaust are, first of all, Jews who lived in the Western Soviet Union. The second large group of Jews who died in the Holocaust are Jews from Poland. Those two groups together make up the vast majority of Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. So if we want to understand the Holocaust, we have to make sure we understand this time and this place. Okay, so to understand it, I think the first thing we have to do is try to understand what the Soviet Union meant for Hitler. So when as Christian says, the Holocaust begins with Operation Barbarossa. It begins with the Wehrmacht, the German army, and the German army's allies invading the Soviet Union in June 1941. But before that invasion, before that fateful, terrible encounter between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, there is Hitler's idea of what that encounter will mean. There is his vision of what this war is going to mean. The vision of war with the Soviet Union is connected extremely intimately with Hitler's vision of what is going to happen to the Jews. The simplest way I can think of to explain this is to say that in Hitler's vision of war with the Soviet Union, there is both a colonial ambition and an exterminatory ambition. And these ambitions to colonize and to destroy arise from the way that Hitler sees the world. The way that Hitler sees the world, as he explains in Mein Kampf and in his second book, is that life is a struggle. World history is a struggle between races. If you don't understand that the only thing that happens in history is a struggle between races, that is because your mind has been taken over by Jews with their humanist ideas, Jews with their ideas about human reciprocity or solidarity. Every idea which leads us away from racial struggle, says Hitler, is Jewish. And that is why it's possible for Hitler to believe that both capitalism and communism are Jewish. This seems like a contradiction, but if you believe that every idea that leads human beings to treat each other as human beings is Jewish, then it makes sense to believe that both capitalism and communism are Jewish. Now, in this way of seeing the world, the Soviet Union then takes on a double significance. The Soviet Union is the territory that Germany must colonize. If life is just a struggle of races, then the superior German race should seize the rich, fertile agricultural territory of Ukraine from the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union, as Hitler thinks, is a Jewish state, then attacking the Soviet Union also means the first battle against Jewish domination of the world. So an attack on the Soviet Union is both colonial, it's about winning land for Germany, and it's exterminatory. It's about trying to destroy what Hitler understands as Jewish domination of the world. So this is one important part of the argument. This is the way Hitler sees the world. But of course, until the 1930s or 1940s, really, those ideas are just ink on paper. They're just things that Hitler wrote down. We now have to ask how you get from that vision of the world to an actual invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. And of course, some of these steps will be familiar, so I'll just mention them very briefly. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 in the context of the Great Depression is an important first part. An important second part is the transformation of the German state in the 1930s. These are more familiar. What I want to spend some time on, though, is what I think of as the twisted path to war, the difficult path to war. So Hitler wanted a war with the Soviet Union, but that's not exactly what the Second World War looks like. I mean, if we start in June 1941, then of course the main conflict is a Soviet-German conflict, and it will be until 1945. But if we look at the beginning of the war, we see a very different picture. And at the beginning of the war, what we find is that it takes Hitler a while to get to the war that he wants. That the path to the war with the Soviet Union is long and even contradictory. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the rise of Germany in the 1930s. The rise of Germany in the 1930s meant that no one really wanted to fight Germany. I mean, there was the memory of the First World War, of course, but also Germany simply looked strong. People in general, nations in general, tried to, in some way or another, cooperate with Germany, or at least avoid conflict with Germany. And in the 1930s, at least, there was a certain ambiguity about what Hitler's ideology and what his goals actually were. So it looked like National Socialism was about economic recovery because Germany was doing relatively well coming out of the Great Depression. In fact, the ideology of National Socialism was about total economic transformation. It was about conquering territory in the East and changing the entire economy. But that wasn't necessarily evident. Similarly, on the surface, National Socialism was about racial unity. It was about gathering in Germans from the borderlands of Germany. But that wasn't what it was really about. It was really about racial war, racial conflict, racial expansion into the East. But again, that wasn't necessarily evident. Even the anti-Semitism that was expressed by Hitler and other Nazi leaders in the 1930s, although appalling and extreme, was not as total and as eliminationist as the actual program would reveal itself to be. So what this meant was that in the 1930s, national leaders, European populations could tell themselves various stories about what Germany was doing. And this meant that it was actually a long time before there was a war. So think of Austria in 1938. The Western powers looking at Austria said, well, Hitler is just trying to gather in the Germans. Many Austrians looking at Nazi Germany said, Hitler has begun an economic recovery. And so there was no one who was going to fight a war to preserve Austria. In the end, not even the Austrians themselves. And so the consequence in 1938 was that Hitler gained a lot of territory, a good deal of population, a good deal of gold, by the way, and hard currency without a war. Think of Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939. Again, it was easy for the Western powers to look at Czechoslovakia and say, Hitler is just trying to gather in the Germans. This is just about unifying the German people. And again, the Germans in Czechoslovakia, the German minority, could look at Nazi Germany and say, Nazi Germany is recovering from economic depression. That's attractive. And again, no one was going to fight a war for Czechoslovakia. On the contrary, the British and the French and the Italians got together with Hitler, as everyone knows, in Munich in 1938, and gave some Czechoslovak territory to Germany. So this is a moment, I mean, it's a shameful moment, not just because of appeasement, but also because it shows how close the British and the French really were to Nazi Germany in the fall of 1938. Not just how unwilling they were to fight a war, but how they misunderstood the threat. So how does Germany actually get to a war when no one wants to fight Germany, when all of Germany's aims seem to be fulfilled without war? The war actually starts in a rather surprising way, and in a way, I think, which is often forgotten, or at least skipped very hastily over. The Second World War in Europe starts because finally there is a country that fights Nazi Germany, and it's a surprise, or at least it's a surprise to the Germans, and that country, of course, is Poland. So here's one of the things which is forgotten and which is very important. Hitler always wanted a war against the Soviet Union. If you are Germany, if you're in the middle of Europe and you're contemplating a war with the Soviet Union, then your natural ally, your natural desired ally is, of course, Poland. Poland is the country between you and the Soviet Union. Between 1934 and 1939, German diplomats and high German officials, including Himmler and Hitler himself, tried to bring the Poles into some kind of offensive military alliance against the Soviet Union. And indeed, the underlying assumption of Hitler's planning for a war against the Soviet Union was that Poland at some point would come along. Meanwhile, from the point of view of Poland, which is between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, from that point of view, the natural foreign policy is not to ally either with the Germans or with the Soviets. The natural foreign policy, and this was Polish foreign policy, was to keep what was called an equal distance, on the logic that there couldn't be a war if we don't ally with one side and we don't ally with the other side. So after Munich, beginning in October 1938, Germany tries very hard to pull Poland into an alliance against the Soviet Union. The Poles stretch this out for as long as they can. They're dilatory, but by the end of January 1939, it's clear that Poland will not ally with Germany against the Soviet Union. Now, by the way, this is a given certain, let's call them discussions about memory that are going on at present, this is an important point to remember. Poland was offered a war against the Soviet Union on the side of the Germans, and it refused. This is an important part of it's an important thing to know, but it's also an important part of the history of the war. Because what follows from that is that all of Hitler's plans have to change. In March 1939, Hitler orders new plans for an invasion of Poland. In the summer of 1939, German propaganda targets mainly Poland. And again, the argument is made that it's the German minority is suffering, we have to protect the German minority, and this becomes the explicit goal of aggression against Poland. Of course, it's not the real goal, but it's what German propaganda is talking about at the time. So the fact that Poland resists Germany is crucial for the way the World War begins. If Poland doesn't resist Germany, then Britain and France probably never enter the war. Britain and France only enter the war because in March of 1939, they give Poland security guarantees, and Poland actually does then fight against Nazi Germany. But Poland resisting Germany also affects the way the war begins in another very fundamental way. Once Britain and France have, in effect, allied with Poland, then Hitler, if he wants to make a war against Poland, also wants to avoid a two-front war. He wants to avoid fighting France and Poland at the same time. And so he comes to the conclusion that from a German geopolitical perspective is very natural, he should have another ally further to the east. And so in August of 1939, the Germans begin in a very hasty way to try to bring the Soviet Union into their war against Poland. So the war begins because Poland resists Nazi Germany, and the war begins, the Second World War begins with the Soviets and the Germans simultaneously attacking Poland. This is of course the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 23 August 1939. That sets the basic terms of the common war effort. This is also a treaty on borders and friendship, which the Germans and the Soviets sign on the 28th of September 1939 at the end of their successful war against Poland. This arrangement also includes an economic agreement of February 1940, by which the Soviets agreed to commit more than half of their exports, mostly food and fuel, to Germany that year and in coming years. So this moment, the way that the war starts is crucial for how the Holocaust can proceed. And before I get into the details of this, I want to make a few just basic logical points about this. The first is that September 1939 is the beginning of the war. That if there's not a war, then there's not going to be a Holocaust. So the way that the war begins is very important. But even more fundamentally, the fact that the war begins is very important. If you look hard at August and September 1939, and you ask, how is Hitler going to begin a war? That's not an easy question to answer. If the Soviets had simply said, we are going to uphold our treaty obligations to Poland. At the time, there was a treaty of non-aggression between Poland and the Soviet Union. If the Soviets had simply said, we're going to uphold our treaty obligations to Poland, how easy would it have been for Germany to fight a war against Poland and Britain and France at the same time? And would Hitler even have done so? We don't know the answer to that question, but what we do know is that he very much wanted an agreement with the Soviet Union in order to begin his war against Poland. Another way that this beginning of the war is crucial for the Holocaust is that it means the destruction of Poland. So one can imagine a war beginning a different way in which Poland would not have been so completely destroyed, but an invasion from east and west by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union at the same time didn't just mean defeat for Poland. It meant the destruction of the Polish state structures. It meant the murder of the Polish intellectual and political elite. And of course, it also meant that suddenly 2 million Jews were under German control. So the War of 1939 means that within a few weeks, the number of Jews under German control increases by a factor of about 7 or 8. There are obviously far more Jews in Poland than there are in Germany. And then a final way that the Soviet-German agreement is crucial for the Holocaust is that it makes Germany much stronger than it would have been otherwise. So the next move that Germany makes, as everyone in France knows, is to invade part of Scandinavia and the Low Countries and France in the spring of 1940. That invasion of France is literally fueled by Soviet supplies. The Soviets are the economic supplier of the German war in Western Europe. And of course, that German war in Western Europe goes very well for the Germans, which makes the German invasion of the Soviet Union much more plausible. So by the end of 1940, with the Germans in control of France, in control of Belgium, able to use West European economic resources against the Soviet Union, the Germans are in a much stronger position to invade the Soviet Union than they were in 1939. And if you combine that with the fact that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has moved the German border considerably to the east, it means that when German armies massed to invade the Soviet Union in May of 1941 and in June of 1941, they're that much closer to Moscow. They're that much closer to Kiev. They're that much closer to the Caucasus. The Russian historian Oleg Budnitsky put it this way. He said that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was worse than a crime. It was a mistake. He's quoting Talleyrand, of course. It's worse than a crime. It was a mistake, and a mistake which cost millions of human lives. Okay, but again, this is all a bit abstract, or rather, this is all about diplomatic history. And important as it is to get these basic points of diplomatic history across, even more important is to see how this twisted road to war, this long road to war, affected the Jews. If we go through this same history of 1938, 1939, 1940, 1941, we observe something essential in the history of Jewish experience, which is that as Germany gets closer and closer to total war, Germans also gain experience with the destruction of institutions and the destruction of states. And as the destruction of institutions and the destruction of states proceeds, life becomes ever more difficult for Jews. So we associate the repression of Jews with Nazi Germany itself, from 1933 to 1939. And of course, the treatment of Jews as second-class citizens, their loss of property rights, the expulsion of Jews from schools, from the professions, all of this is terrible. But what we see is that as German power moves beyond Germany, and as other states are destroyed, the repression of Jews in other countries is much more rapid and indeed much more severe. So when Austria is destroyed in March of 1938, within a matter of weeks, Austrian Jews go through all of the experiences that German Jews go through in the previous 5 years and more. when Czechoslovakia is destroyed, as it is finally by Germany in March of 1939, its Jews suffer much more than German Jews do, very quickly. The Jews of Slovakia very quickly lose basic civil rights, and before long are sent to Auschwitz. The Jews of the far east of Czechoslovakia, in a region called Subcarpathian Ruthenia, those Jews come under Hungarian power. The Hungarians never grant them citizenship. And then in 1941, when Germany invades the Soviet Union, Hungary expels those Jews eastward into the path of the Wehrmacht. And what happens to those Jews, to those Czechoslovak Jews, who are then under Hungarian power, what happens to them is that they are murdered at Kamieniec-Podilsky in the first large-scale massacre of the Holocaust. So the destruction of states and the loss of citizenship is very intimately connected to mass murder. In Poland in 1939, the Germans use Einsatzgruppen for the first time to carry out policies of mass murder. These policies of mass murder are sometimes directed against Jews, but in the beginning, they're mostly directed against the Polish elite. But the crucial point here is that the Einsatzgruppen are instructed to behave as if there is no law, as if there is no state. And the way that Poland is treated is as a colonial possession, where no law really applies, where civil rights and property rights simply don't exist. Meanwhile, if we consider the territories just east of this in 1939, we see another very strikingly dangerous situation. So when Germany invades Poland from the west, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the east. The next summer in 1940, the Soviet Union also occupies and then annexes the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In all of these territories, in Eastern Poland, in Latvia and Lithuania, Estonia, there are rapid policies of Sovietization, which involve mass deportations, which involve, in several cases, mass murders, most notoriously the mass murders known under the name of Katyn, of educated Polish people and Polish officers. But this experience was also a Jewish experience. The experience of Soviet occupation and annexation meant that Jewish civil society essentially was taken apart. Jewish educational institutions, at least the ones that existed before, were no longer able to function. Jewish property owners lost their property, and Jews who fled Nazi Germany to the Soviet side of the border were in large numbers deported to Kazakhstan. So the experience of Jews in these new Soviet territories was such that Jews generally tried to flee. And an interesting example of this that some of you might know is that of the Japanese consul Sugihara. So the Japanese consul in Lithuania, a man called Sugihara, is rightly famous for having given tens of thousands of documents to Jews, allowing them to flee. And it's rightfully remembered that him giving these documents to Jews helped those Jews to survive the Holocaust. But the interesting thing is that those Jews were not actually fleeing the Holocaust. The Holocaust hadn't started yet. Those Jews were actually fleeing Soviet power. So the point is that the rapid Sovietization of these territories was itself a shattering and violent experience for almost everyone involved. And it also created certain kinds of very dangerous political potentials, because it meant that anyone who collaborated with Soviet power was going to be looking for excuses when the Germans invaded. And so most of the collaborators with Soviet power were not Jewish. And when the Germans invaded and they said, all the communists are Jews and all the Jews are communists, that was very convenient for all of the collaborators who were not Jewish. It made it very easy for them to collaborate with the Germans and then to point to the Jews as being the people who were the collaborators. There was an even more dangerous political potential created in the Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania completely ceased to exist. This meant that there was political anger, there was political desire for revenge, which the Germans could and did use when they invaded these territories in the summer of 1941. So to put the point in a more general way, or the most general way possible, the long, difficult, and winding road to war from the Jewish perspective showed that the great danger to Jews was the loss of citizenship. The quickest way to lose citizenship was to have your state destroyed. Austria being destroyed was faster and more dangerous than Nuremberg laws in Germany. Czechoslovakia being destroyed and not being merged to Germany was more dangerous than Austria being destroyed and being merged to Germany. Poland being destroyed by Germany and the Polish civil code, Polish property rights, all going away were extremely dangerous for Jews. That was the background to Jews being placed in ghettos in late 1940. But maybe most dangerous for Jews in the end was a situation of double state destruction. That is the situation where the Soviets destroyed the state once in 1939, and then the Germans came and tried to destroy the state a second time in the summer of 1941. To be very clear, I'm not claiming that Soviet policies were intended to make Jews vulnerable. What I'm claiming is that Soviet policies of state destruction created patterns and possibilities which the Germans could then sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously exploit. So the years 1939 to 1941, it's important to remember, were very strange for Jews under Soviet control. I just finished reading a wonderful, terrible, wonderful Gulag memoir by a man called Julius Margolin. It's one of the 2 or 3 most important Gulag memoirs of all. He was from Palestine, but a Polish Jew, and he was in the Gulag during the entire Second World War. And he remembered that, you know, when he could see a scrap of newspaper in 1939 and 1940, it was always full of praise for Nazi Germany, right? These were strange years for the Jews. And these were strange years for the left, of course. 1939, 1940, 1941. This was a time when communists were told, not communists outside of the Soviet Union, were told not to resist Nazi Germany. They were told that France and Britain were the true enemy, the true capitalist enemy. But I think that the most important element of these years, 1939, 1941, is the dangers that they created for the Jews by beginning a war in the places where Jews lived, and then finally by this terrible confrontation between 2 horrible projects of transformation. So this brings us back to 1941. We've talked about 3 things. We've talked about the vision in Hitler's mind of a war of destruction with the Soviet Union. We've talked about the complicated path to that war, which leads through Austria and Czechoslovakia and Poland, and then the war on the Western Front before Hitler finally gets to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941. And we've talked about the experience of Jews from 1938 to 1941, and how the increasing depth of statelessness. We've talked about how the separation of Jews from the state threatens Jews more and more as time passes. This brings us now to what actually happens in 1941. It brings us to Kamianets-Podilsky, to Kiev, to Riga, to Minsk, to the hundreds of killing sites where Jews were murdered by first in the hundreds, then in the thousands, then in the tens of thousands in 1941. We've seen this ideology, we've seen the twisted path to war, we've seen the accumulation of state destruction. We've seen how the war was the ideology was a necessary condition for what happened in 1941, but not a sufficient condition. We've seen how the war was a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. And we have an idea now, and the idea is that the destruction of political institutions and their replacement with racial ideology is going to be the thing which is threatening to the Jews. And so now we can look again and we can see patterns in what happens in 1941. When the Germans invade the Soviet Union, the first thing they're invading is the lands which the Soviet Union had just annexed. They're invading the Baltic countries, they're invading Eastern Poland. And the very first thing they do is that they incite pogroms. Notoriously at Jedwabne, but Jedwabne was one of a couple dozen cases like that in Poland. There were a similar number of large pogroms in Western Ukraine. The first thing that the Germans do is they incite pogroms. And the way they incite pogroms is they say, the Jews are the communists. And very often, the people who take part in pogroms are trying to prove that they themselves were not Soviet collaborators. All of the evil of the Soviet experience is unfairly, completely unfairly placed upon the Jews. The next thing the Germans do is they carry out mass killing by Einsatzgruppen. And the Einsatzgruppen are precisely the state destroyers. They're the people who had been destroying the Polish state. Now they're destroying the Soviet state, but they identify the Soviet state with the Jews. And so whereas in Poland, they had killed the Polish elite, in the Soviet Union, among other targets, they're killing the Jews. But what the Einsatzgruppen find, and what the SS find, is that it's easy to recruit enough local people, that is to say, enough Soviet citizens, to carry out ever more organized and ever larger shooting campaigns. And by the way, this turns out to be true throughout the Soviet Union, not just in the Western fringe, which experienced double occupation, but also in the pre-war Soviet Union. People of all nationalities inside the Soviet Union collaborated in the German mass murder of the Jews. And then the next discovery, which was perhaps the most important, was that regular German policemen, Ordnungspolizei, people who might or might not have had any special training, when they were brought into a zone like this, far away from home, into a zone like this where they were told that everything was permitted, where normal law didn't apply, that they would take part in mass killing operations. And in all of the big killing operations that I've mentioned, indeed, in every single one very large shooting action in the Western Soviet Union, it was not just the Einsatzgruppen. There were not enough Einsatzgruppen. It wasn't the local people. They were not well organized enough. It was the regular German Ordnungspolizei, the regular German order police, who provided the crucial manpower to make those very large shooting operations possible. So the murder begins in June. By the time we get to August, we have huge mass murders on the scale of not just thousands, but tens of thousands. And by December, we have Hitler openly communicating to German authorities that the mass extermination, the total extermination of Jews is the goal. Some of this acceleration has to do with the experience of the war itself. As the Germans move east, they don't move as quickly as they expect, and therefore the idea of blaming the Jews gains more importance. Because the Germans don't move east as quickly as they think, all of these order police, all these Ordnungspolizei are concentrated in a small area without the expected work that they were supposed to have. So one of the jobs they're given is killing the Jews. And then in December of 1941, as we reach the end of 1941, we see finally geopolitics come into the picture. At the end of 1941, we see the world start to give Hitler an opportunity to finally give voice to the whole horror, to the full horror of his ideology. In the end of 1941, two things happen. The first is the Red Army counterattacks for the first time around Moscow. So it's very clear that the German goal of destroying the Soviet Union is not going to succeed, at least not in 1941. The second thing that happens at almost exactly the same time is that the Japanese attack the United States, and the United States declares war not only on Japan, but on Germany. So suddenly, by December of 1941, it's as though Hitler has created the world he was talking about the whole time. He's fighting not just the communists, he's also fighting the capitalists. He's not fighting just the Soviet Union, he's fighting the British and the Americans all at the same time. And how to make sense of this, says Hitler. The only way to make sense of this, says Hitler, is to understand that the Jews are behind the capitalists and the Jews are behind the communists. And therefore, the only way to win this war is to exterminate the Jews wherever we find them. That's the end of 1941. That's the way that Hitler's ideology comes full circle and creates a world in which it can express itself. And this is how the first horrible year of the Holocaust takes place. Thank you for your attention.
Merci Tim de ce très bel exposé. Je vais parler en français pour que les gens, c'est plus immédiat, je pense. C'était un très très bel exposé. C'est même, je dirais, un peu ennuyeux parce que pendant que vous étiez en train de parler, j'essayais de noter fébrilement quelles questions j'allais pouvoir vous poser. Et puis, très souvent, 2 minutes après que j'ai noté une question, vous aviez donné la réponse. Et donc, j'ai eu un peu de mal à trouver tout ça. Et pourtant, j'ai quand même quelques questions à vous poser qui montrent bien, je pense, l'intérêt de tout ça. Vous avez, dans l'exposé, ce qui était très intéressant, c'est que vous avez commencé par faire un exposé qui est très hitlérocentré, quand vous avez fait toute cette partie assez classique sur la diplomatie. Puis, on a eu quelque chose qui, quand ça s'est ouvert sur 1938, 1941, on a eu quelque chose dans lequel, là, cette fois-ci, on s'occupait vraiment des Allemands. Et la fin de votre exposé était très intéressante parce que quand vous abordez la question des politiques de soviétisation et de leur interaction avec juin 1941, on arrive à quelque chose qui est de l'ordre de la dimension européenne du génocide, malgré tout, inexorablement, la façon dont les populations ont dû se positionner par rapport aux politiques qui étaient en train de se mettre en place. Et j'aurais voulu que vous approfondissiez un petit peu ce point, hein, montrer que malgré tout, la Shoah n'est pas, je pense, à concevoir comme un face-à-face entre des bourreaux allemands et des victimes juives, mais bien une sorte de pièce de théâtre, de tragédie, hein, parce maintenant on connaît la fin, c'est nous historiens qui disons que c'est une tragédie, mais une tragédie dans laquelle il y a un grand nombre de protagonistes, il y a des victimes juives, mais il y a aussi des tueurs baltes, des tueurs d'enfants baltes, des mécaniciens français, des gendarmes hollandais et évidemment ici des nationalistes ukrainiens qui ont donné leur écho. Et donc, dans cette première question, j'aurais aussi voulu savoir ce que vous pensez. J'ai l'impression, malgré tout, quand on observe les situations, qu'il y a un endroit dans ces Bloodlands dans lesquels les nazis n'ont pas réussi à recruter de population locale, et c'est la Biélorussie. En Biélorussie, quand on regarde ce qui se passe à Minsk en novembre 1941, les gens les supplétifs qui tuent des juifs sont lettons. Donc j'aimerais bien, c'est la première question que j'ai à vous poser. La deuxième question, c'est vous avez avec beaucoup de talent montré comment les basculements se mettaient en place à partir de l'été 1941, mais au fond, tout ce débat qui a eu lieu sur la décision du génocide, avec Chris Browning qui voulait un génocide en juillet 1941 et Christine Garlach qui en voulait en décembre 1941, pose la question du statut du génocide. Pour Chris Browning, c'est un génocide qui apparaît au moment de la victoire. Et donc, nous allons pouvoir réaliser notre rêve, il faut les tuer. Donc, un génocide d'euphorie. D'un autre côté, Christiane Garlach nous dit, comme vous l'avez dit d'ailleurs, que le génocide est diffusé par Hitler en décembre 1941, après l'échec de l'offensive sur Moscou, après Pearl Harbor, et donc on a ici plus un génocide d'angoisse. J'aimerais bien savoir comment vous est-ce que vous articulez les deux, est-ce que vous choisissez entre les deux. Ça, c'est mes deux questions principales. J'en ai deux dernières, si vous permettez, Timothée. La première, c'est on aurait pu aussi on aurait pu avoir quelque chose dans tout ça d'un tout petit peu plus large peut-être, et utiliser 1941 comme un vantage point, comme un point d'observation des choses, un belvédère si vous préférez. Alors vous l'avez fait merveilleusement avec la question des politiques soviétiques dans les Bloodlands, mais on aurait pu aussi parler un petit peu de ce qui se passait dans ce premier semestre de 1941, et notamment les politiques de préparation logistique de Barbarossa. Vous l'avez fait dans Bloodlands, vous parlez du Hunger Plan, mais je pense que ça aurait été intéressant d'avoir quelque chose là-dessus, parce que ça pose la question de l'intentionnalité des forces armées allemandes. Et puis, deuxième point sur lequel j'aurais bien aimé avoir eu un mot de vous, c'est bien sûr la question du traitement des prisonniers de guerre. Entre juillet et décembre 1941, ce sont février 1942, ce sont 2 500 000 prisonniers de guerre qui sont tués, et c'est le premier véritable massacre de masse absolument massif que mettent en place les nazis. Donc voilà, ça c'était ma troisième question. J'en ai une toute dernière pour vous. Dans toute la première partie c'est une question plus personnelle et plus épistémologique. Dans toute la première partie de votre raisonnement, on a eu l'impression que vous aviez un raisonnement qui essayait de remonter au point d'origine causale, de cause du génocide, et que c'est ce qui vous a amené au 30 janvier 1933. J'ai l'impression que derrière tout ça, et vous l'avez plusieurs fois exprimé, il y a une sorte de raisonnement par le what if history. Par qu'est-ce qui se serait passé comme ça? Qu'est-ce que vous pensez, donc ce sera ma dernière question, de ces démarches qu'on appelle des démarches uchroniques, ces démarches de what if history, comme dans le monde anglo-saxon, Niall Ferguson a pu le faire dans cette publication qui s'appelle Virtual History. Voilà, il me reste, Tim, à vous relaisser la parole, à vous remercier de cette très très belle conférence, et puis ensuite, je pense que quand vous aurez terminé tout cela, on pourra passer la parole à la salle virtuelle.
Okay, thank you very much for those beautiful questions. I'm going to try to answer all four of them, and also try to leave some time for others who want to take part. So the first question is very well put. I mean, what you have is you have German ideas. You have a German state that wants war, which is not typical in Europe at the time. So you have an unusual ideology. I mean, Hitler. The strange thing about Hitler is that, I mean, there were many people on the far right, and some of them came to power, but Hitler was an unusually radical example of the far right, and he came to power in a major country. And that, in some sense, that's just terrible luck. But so you have ideology in the German leadership. You have a German state that wants to go to war. And then, as you say, the Germans need help going to war at the beginning, right? And this is where I think the history of the Soviet Union has to be looked at much more carefully. I mean, there's a big tendency in Soviet history to jump over the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Nobody in the United States has written a monograph about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact since the 1950s. And nobody in Russia can write about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact because it's basically illegal. But the Germans needed help to start the war. They got help from the Soviet Union. As you say, the Germans needed help to kill Jews. They couldn't have done it on their own. And so then the question is, for me, why do some people help and in what conditions? And the basic answer that I develop in my book, Black Earth, is that has to do with the experience of statelessness as well. That there aren't really significant ethnic differences, that in general, it has to do with a political experience. And I find it ironic that we lean so much into ethnic explanations. I think the explanation is really political. You're quite right about Belarus, at least in 1941. By 1942 and 1943, you do find a fair amount of Belarusian collaboration with the Germans. But you're right, the Belarusians do not have a political motivation because there isn't a Belarusian national movement. I mean, insofar as there was a Belarusian national movement, its leaders were executed in the Soviet Great Terror in 1937 and 1938. In Ukraine, you have more of a political motivation because, as you say, there are nationalists who, at least at the beginning, think that the Germans can help them create a state. And then in the Baltic states, you have an even bigger political motivation because there you have actual states which the Soviets destroyed. And so the Germans can very easily argue, we're going to help you rebuild your state. It's all a lie. They're not, but it's a political motivation which doesn't exist in Belarus. And so I can see the difference. The second question is about this debate about when the Holocaust begins, and it's now an old debate. There's one side which says the Holocaust begins because of German victory, and there's another side which says the Holocaust begins because of German defeat. I would say, for one thing, the Holocaust happens because of learning that the Holocaust was possible. So in June of 1941, I don't think the Germans understood some of the things they understood in August and September of 1941. I don't think they knew that the Holocaust was possible. It's in August that you start to read the reports where people say things like, we believe that a total solution is possible in the East. You know these sources. And then what I think is that it's more a question of changing the story. So at the end of 1941, the Germans have not won the war that they thought they were going to win. The Germans invaded the Soviet Union with the premise that they were going to win within 3 months, 2 to 3 months. So by December, it's been 6 months. The Soviets are counterattacking. That hasn't happened. So when Hitler on December 12th and a bunch of other times says, this is the fault of the Jews, we're going to destroy the Jews, I think he's changing the story. And it's not so much victory or defeat, it's changing, it's coming up with a new explanation for why we're fighting. And this is connected with your third question, which is very good, about German planning, which I didn't have time to go into. The Germans, as Christian Inqual says, the Germans had planned a vast colonization of the Soviet Union, which was called Generalplan Ost. So over the course of 15 years or so, they were going to deport millions of people, starve millions of people, and carry out basically settler colonization. And then there was a more specific plan called the Hunger Plan, which was going to take place over the fall and winter of 1941 to 1942, in which, again, more than 10 million people were going to be starved. What happens, as I see it, is that as the Germans invade, and as the war doesn't go the way that they're expecting,
those plans become less plausible, but the final solution becomes more plausible. And as I understand it, there's a kind of evolution whereby those plans fade from the picture and the final solution becomes more central. And sometimes it's quite literal, right? So you mentioned the Soviet prisoners of war. And as Christian Ingval quite rightly says, about 3 million Soviet prisoners of war are killed by early 1942. So there were far more Soviet prisoners of war killed than Jews in 1941. There were more Soviet prisoners of war killed in Poland in 1941 than there were Jews, because some Soviet prisoners of war were brought to Poland in order to be starved to death. But you can see a connection in early 1942 when Soviet prisoners of war are taken out of the camps, and some of them are brought into collaborating police units, where they then take part in the Holocaust, which is going to be the major killing policy in 1942. But Christian Ingval makes a very important point, which is that if you stop the clock in December 1941, you would say the major German atrocity is the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war. There are more than twice as many Soviet prisoners of war had been killed than Jews at that point. It's only knowing what we know now that we say 1941 was the beginning of this thing that we call the Holocaust. And then on counterfactuals. So here's what I think about counterfactuals. Every time we make a causal argument, we are also making an implied counterfactual argument. So every time we say A causes B, we are saying if there weren't A, then there wouldn't be B, right? And so I think counterfactual arguments are important as a check, right? So what I'm saying is the Second World War started with a Soviet-German agreement. That's how it started. If we think that was important, let's check it by asking, how else could the Second World War have started? And I don't know, right? I don't know. So I like counterfactual arguments in the sense of as a check. I don't really like them when you keep then making stuff up afterwards, because I think history is so infernally complicated that as soon as you change more than one thing, you never know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, they are the best way to exercise the. Very right. Thank you, Tim. Je pense qu'on va laisser maintenant la parole à la salle.
Alors, je reprends du service. Il y a énormément de questions, donc ça va être impossible. Christian, restez là aussi, parce que vous pourriez, je pense, participer, sans doute répondre aussi à certaines questions. Il y a des personnes qui lèvent la main aussi, mais beaucoup de questions ont été posées, Timothy, pendant votre conférence. Je poserai peut-être la question d'une auditrice en premier, car elle rejoint votre introduction en disant comment se fait-il qu'il est si difficile de commémorer 1941, l'année 1941 par rapport à d'autres années phares de l'arrivée des nazis au pouvoir et de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Donc une auditrice qui demande pourquoi associons-nous le plus souvent l'année 1942 avec le début de la solution finale plutôt que 1941 ? J'ai toujours eu en tête la date de 1942. Mm-hmm. C'est une question qui a été posée en français, donc qui je pense, est liée à l'historiographie française, occidentale sur le sujet.
Mm-hmm. 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 So if you think that the Holocaust is the gas chambers, then the Holocaust begins in 1942. I didn't quite have time to talk about this, but there's a transition from 1941 to 1942 where German commanders who are looking at these mass shootings in the East ask if there's another technique, and they bring in the technique which they had used to kill people designated as handicapped, which is suffocation by way of carbon monoxide. And that technique is used at Belzec, Chełmno, Sobibor, Treblinka in 1942. So if you think of the Holocaust as gas chambers, Chełmno starts in December 1941, the other three start in 1942, and then the Polish Jews are killed in those gas chambers, most of them. So if you're thinking of the Holocaust as the murder of the Jews of Warsaw, then that's Treblinka, and that's 1942. If you're thinking of the Holocaust as the clearing of the Polish ghettos, that's largely in 1942. I don't know why that would be a French perspective, honestly, because the Holocaust in France is actually stretches on and is a bit later. But in 1942 is when the gas chambers become the most important technique of killing. So that could be why. But I mean, there's something else about 1941, which is that to take 1941 seriously, you have to be researching in the Soviet Union. You have to be thinking, I mean, as Christian Ingao has done, you have to be thinking about Belarus and Ukraine and the Baltic states, all of these places which weren't central to the European imagination of the Holocaust. I mean, the European imagination of the Holocaust for decades was about Germany, France, and Italy. And then Poland was somewhere off there in a shadowy east, but we didn't really think about the Soviet Union. And I mean, the Memorial de la Shoah has done a very good job at changing that. So I can't tell you why, you know, I don't know about anyone's personal reasons for this, but that's the best I can do for a general answer.
Question suivante peut-être.
Christian, vous voulez ajouter quelque chose?
Non, je n'avais pas grand-chose à ajouter, à part que, évidemment, 42 est considéré comme une date bien plus importante parce que depuis qu'on enseigne la Shoah dans le secondaire notamment, les dates clés qui sont données sont des dates qui sont soit la conférence de Wannsee qui est juste un mois après tout ce que Tim a raconté, soit la date de juillet 1942 et la date du Veldiv parce que les approches sont un peu franco-centrées. Et donc, c'est, je pense, ce qui explique que 1942 soit le point de gravité de la mémoire française de la Shoah. Mais bon, c'était...
Ok, alors tout le monde, évidemment, Timothy Snyder vous remercie chaleureusement avant chaque question. Donc je vais passer la parole maintenant aux personnes qui lèvent la main parce que c'est aussi agréable d'entendre les gens s'exprimer directement. Donc Samy Goldberg, on va activer votre micro. Vous êtes toujours là?
J'ai activé son micro. Hein.
Alors, parce qu'il a levé la main il y a très longtemps, donc je voulais lui donner la parole, mais peut-être que vous n'êtes plus là, Samy Goldberg. Alors, je vais sans transition passer la parole à Marie Mora. Bon. Marie Mora, toujours été un petit temps avec Zoom. Est-ce que vous nous entendez? Est-ce que Alexandre, je pense que tu as activé son micro?
Oui, tout à fait. Oui.
Bon.
Peut-être passe à Eva. Ou...
Alors, je vais passer à Eva Bérard qui avait également posé sa question par écrit. Donc, Eva Bérard, je vous passe la parole.
Une seconde, voilà, je suis. Vous m'entendez là? Oui.
Très bien.
Je vais la poser en français, je la poser en anglais.
En anglais ou en français, comme vous voulez.
Je vais faire en français quand même. Et la question porte sur un document que je connais en russe et qui est connu en russe seulement. Mais ma question était, qu'est-ce que vous en pensez? Alors, le document date de février 1940 et c'est une demande de la part des Allemands d'Eichmann probablement vers le ministère de Molotov et vers le ministère des mouvements de population, quelque chose comme ça, et qui porte, enfin, la demande l'Union soviétique ne voudrait-elle pas prendre sous ses ailes tous les juifs qui se trouvent sous le pouvoir, sous le gouvernement, sous l'occupation allemande? Connaissez-vous ce document et qu'en pensez-vous? Qu'en pensez-vous sur le document lui-même et sur la question, sur les refus soviétiques? Bon, j'ai une petite idée là-dessus qui est une idée historique un peu, mais bon.
So I think that document places itself rather comfortably in the history of the somewhat chaotic German thinking about the final solution. So there are several different final solutions. There's the idea that we're going to send the Jews of Europe to Madagascar, which, strange though it sounds, is actually a normal colonial way of thinking. I mean, this is still a world of empire, and the idea of transporting unwanted populations far away was quite normal at the time. I mean, the Americans had just finished putting their native populations in reservations. The Soviets had deported whole nations to different parts of Asia. And it was still a world of empire. And so the thinking was, we defeat the French, the British won't stop us, we'll send the Jews to Madagascar. The French were defeated, but the British were not interested, and so the Jews couldn't go to Madagascar. Another idea was, okay, we'll send the Jews to Siberia. We'll send them to the Gulag. The idea being that will be some kind of terrible irony because we think the Jews created the Soviet Union, so we'll punish the Jews in the Gulag. But in between those ideas, as you say, there seems to have been this idea of sending the Jews to the Soviet Union before we fight the Soviet Union. And I actually mentioned this, I think, in both of my books. I certainly mention it in Black Earth. And it's not surprising that the Soviets were not interested in this. I mean, as far as we know, there's no reply, but it's not surprising that they weren't interested. We know that the Soviets were very much not interested in taking Jewish refugees. In 1939, Jews who tried to flee Poland to the Soviet Union had a very difficult time. They were often shot as they tried to cross the border. If they did get across the border, they were very likely to be deported to Kazakhstan. And Soviet behavior, was also just, I mean, to be fair, was typical of world behavior. There was no country in the world which was going to take 2 million Jews in 1940. I mean, at the Evian conference, no country in the world except the Dominican Republic was willing to take any Jews at all. The only thing you can say about the Soviets in this particular context is that the Soviet Union was the only country in the world which had acted to put more Jews under German control. That's the one thing which is a bit special about them. The date of that document is, I think it's February 1940, right? And the Soviets had just in September of 1939 signed a treaty with Germany, which left Warsaw and Western Poland on the German side, therefore ensuring that 2 million Jews were in Germany. So that's what I think about the document. It's an interesting document, but I don't think it stands out particularly. I think it fits pretty comfortably in what we think about Soviet-German relations at the time.
Ton micro. Julie Mac, votre micro.
Julie, ton micro. Julie, ton micro.
Désolée, parce que j'imprimais en même temps, alors je vais passer la parole
juste pour to tell you, thank you very much
à Marthe Cadar.
And for the lecture. That's all.
Et il y a quelqu'un qui parle en même temps? Non, c'est bon. Donc, à Marthe Cadar. Et puis j'annonce que Laurence Pelta, qui a posé une question par écrit, pourra poser sa question oralement. Donc Marthe, c'est à vous.
Marc, vous avez activé votre micro, mais on ne vous entend pas.
Ah,
Oui.
pardon, j'avais laissé mon micro désactivé ailleurs. Donc, bonjour à tout le monde. Merci beaucoup de me laisser poser cette question. Merci au Mémorial d'organiser cette conférence et merci beaucoup Timothy pour ce que vous avez expliqué. J'ai trouvé ça particulièrement éclairant. J'avais une question. Vous avez dit tout à l'heure, in the battles over the memory of World War II, it is an important thing to remember that Poland was offered a war against Russia and refused. What did you mean by this comment about the current battles over memory, and why is it especially important to remember this specific part of the beginning of the way World War II happened?
Mm-hmm. So, I'm going to answer your question in a very general way, but don't worry, I'm going to come back to this specific question. So, in a general way, the problem of the memory of the Second World War often has to do with dates. So, I'm an American. Let me start with America. We think of the Second World War as starting in 1941. And then we think of ourselves as having gone to Europe and rescued everyone, including the Jews. But of course, the war had already been going on for 2 years by the time we entered it, and we entered it too late to really do anything about the Holocaust. That's an example of how dates are very important. In the Soviet Union, or rather in contemporary Russia, there's I think, more dramatic example of the same issue, which is that the war in Russia is thought of as starting in 1941 and ending in 1945. So when Christian and Clau used the phrase guerre patriotique, this doesn't mean the Second World War 1939 to 1945. It means, if you say it in Russian, it means 1941 to 1945. So the first 2 years of the war are entirely censored out. That's just forgotten, or there's specific propaganda about it. And now I'm moving to your specific question. One of the things that Mr. Putin has been doing in the last 2 years or so is that he's been playing around in the history of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They started by saying, look, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact isn't so bad because European diplomacy in the 1930s was just tough. Everybody was doing these kinds of things. And then there was a tentative move to say, actually, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was good. It was geopolitically very intelligent. Right? They experimented with that. And then the latest thing, which has been going on for more than a year now, has been to say that actually Poland did something worse. So it's like there's this, I don't know how to say this in French, but in English it's whataboutism, like this idea that, whatever bad thing we did, we can find something that someone else did. So the idea is that Poland actually started the Second World War with the Germans, and that it's all Poland's fault, and that the Poles are terrible anti-Semites, and that really Poland and Germany were together. And that, for me, that seems like a very hard position to sustain. But but then I realized most people don't even know about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Most people don't even know about it. Nobody writes about it. And so this is why I think it's particularly important to remember the actual chain of events. And I don't say this because Poland was a perfect country at the time. It wasn't. But the actual chain of events is Hitler wants to attack the Soviet Union with a Polish ally, but Poland says no. Hitler wants to attack Poland with a Soviet ally, and the Soviet Union says yes. Those are the elementary facts about 1939. And if you know those facts, then the current Russian campaign against Poland doesn't make any sense. Now, I mean, as a historian, I'm trying to referee this one issue. I'm not trying to say, by the way, that everything in Polish memory policy at the moment is acceptable. There are plenty of things in Polish memory policy right now which are totally unacceptable. I'm not saying Russia always wrong, Poland always right. But in this particular issue, what the Russians are saying, that Poland helped start the Second World War, is not only incorrect, it's just terribly ironic, because in fact, it was the Soviet Union which got together with Nazi Germany to start the Second World War.
Merci. Avant de donner la parole à Laurence Pelta, je vous relais 2 questions par écrit. Je les groupe, même si elles n'ont pas à voir les unes avec les autres, mais c'est pour essayer d'avancer parce qu'il y a vraiment beaucoup de questions. La première question, c'est: pourriez-vous nous parler des approvisionnements économiques soviétiques livrés à l'Allemagne nazie pendant la guerre à l'Ouest? Et la seconde question, qui est plus une remarque, enfin un point de vue qui diffère de ce qui a été exposé. La minorité allemande en Pologne a été une idée fixe très importante de la politique nationaliste allemande à partir du XXe siècle, et tout particulièrement avec l'expulsion des citoyens parlant allemand en 1919. Donc, cet auditeur nous dit qu'il ne pense pas que la guerre était juste une chose tactique, étant donné que le projet colonial depuis 1915 a toujours inclus la Lituanie, la Pologne, la Galicie et l'Ukraine.
Okay. So on the
yeah, Christian, tu peux peut-être compléter, c'est la question de...
Pas sûr que je comprends la deuxième question.
Oui, de ma... Je ne sais plus c'est de qui la question que tu m'as demandé de relayer. De Martin Linder.
Christian, you don't have your microphone on. Microphone.
Question, votre micro, Christian.
Le micro.
Sorry. Okay, the question is the following. The German minority in Poland has been a very important idée fixe of the German nationalist politics since the beginning of the 19th century, especially since the expulsion of the German-speaking citizens of 1919. So the point is really the war against Poland a tactical thing. The colonial project since 1915 has always included Lithuania, Poland, and Galicia. The question is a question about the memory and its role in the German planification, I think.
Okay, I got it. So on the first question, the first question is about the economic support of the Soviet Union for Nazi Germany, which is very important and largely overlooked, partly because we've gotten out of the habit of doing economic history. We tend to think in terms of culture and ideology, and we forget about economics. So very basic facts about Germany in 1939. Germany was not self-sufficient in food. And so in a situation of European war, when it's going to be blockaded by Great Britain, it very much needed someone who could deliver food to it. And that someone was the Soviet Union. In 1940, the Soviet Union diverted its exports of grain from Ukraine precisely. I forget what the percentage is, but it's a majority. It diverted the exports of grain from Ukraine to Germany in 1940. And then the other main export was fuel. So here I don't have the numbers in mind, but the Soviets are a net exporter of fuel, of oil, because of the Caucasus. And again, the Germans are not even vaguely self-sufficient in energy supplies. the way Hitler thinks about 1940 is that he says, okay, 1940 showed us that we in order to fight a war, we need food from Ukraine and oil from the Caucasus. So the conclusion is we need to control Ukraine and the Caucasus, which is the goal in 1941. On the second question, this tradition in German geopolitical thinking is, of course, very important. It's more important than Hitler in the sense that many more Germans believe it. Many more Germans think that they think something like Versailles was unfair and we should readjust the borders in the East, right? That you're right. There's a political consensus about that in Germany. That's the centrist position in Germany. And Hitler knew that. And so what Hitler pretended to be was one more German revisionist who's trying to gather in the Germans. He pretended to be that also to the Germans, right? I mean, so in the summer of 1939, the reason when Germans really didn't want war, I mean, there wasn't particularly any popular rush for war, but the reason why the war was kind of acceptable was that it was portrayed as a war to adjust the boundaries and to bring the Germans back into Poland. But in Hitler's mind, it was never about that. It was about destroying the Polish state and beginning a much grander colonial project than just parts of Poland and Galicia and so on. So he was posing as being a revisionist in that sense, but actually his revisionism was much more profound.
Ton micro, Julie.
Oui, j'ai vu. Je vais passer la parole à Laurence Pelta. Donc, votre micro est activé.
Oui, c'est bon, Madame Pelta. Vous pouvez activer votre micro. Votre micro est ouvert, je pense que...
On n'entend pas.
Bon. C'est
Ouais.
un peu difficile de s'y retrouver.
Peut-être on va passer à Marc Cadar.
Il y avait une autre personne qui avait levé la main, mais... Bon, alors je vais poser une autre question qui a été posée par écrit. Quelle a été l'étendue de la participation des forces non allemandes et des civils à la Shoah après le 22 juin 1941?
So when we talk about non-German forces, I would begin that question a little bit differently. The invasion of the Soviet Union was a European project. I mean, the whole Romanian army was involved, and the Romanian army was a big army, and then Hungary, some Croatians, some Spaniards, Slovaks. So in order to get this question answered, you have to start with the invasion of the Soviet Union was also not just the Germans, it was the Germans and their allies. And the allies never talk about it, right? The Italians never talk about the tens of thousands of Italians who died at Stalingrad, right? Can you imagine that? We never talk about that. But Italy invaded the Soviet Union along with Germany, but no one ever remembers that. So that's the first thing. I mean, there were other European armed forces besides the Germans who made the war possible. And in terms of non-German participants in the Shoah, I mean, the critical point to be made is that this was a German undertaking. And even the things which seemed spontaneous, like the pogroms, they were part of a German policy. That's one part. The other part is the Germans never had enough people that they could have carried out this policy by themselves. Even the shooting, they didn't really have enough people on their own, let alone gathering up. And so, especially by the time you get to 1942, the ratio of local people to Germans in the police is often 10 to 1, 15 to 1, even 20 to 1. But it's always German leadership. It's always a German policy. Then, as far as like the non-Germans, I would repeat that once you get, the critical thing is, are you in the Soviet zone or not? In the Soviet zone, where the Germans are carrying out policies of mass shooting, basically everyone collaborates. There's some groups that collaborate a little bit more, like the ethnic Germans collaborate a little bit more. And there are some groups that collaborate a little bit less, like as Christian says at the beginning, the Belarusians. But in general, it's a safe generalization to say that pretty much everybody collaborated in the same way. And so it's important for me not to talk, like, you can talk about specific, like if you talk about specific people, then you can say that was a Latvian or a Lithuanian. But if you talk about collaboration, what I have learned is that it was a pretty general social phenomenon, and that Russians who were put in the same situation as Belarusians or Ukrainians behaved essentially the same way across ethnicity. So those are my general points about that.
Merci, je passe la parole à Yuri. Je ne vois pas le nom en entier.
Oui, bonjour, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Alors, je vais poser ma question à Tim en anglais, si ça ne pose pas de problème. Tim, I asked a question earlier, but it probably wasn't phrased too well. But I've always been quite curious about the shift in policy of the Einsatzgruppen between 1939 and the invasion of Poland, where, from my understanding, their role was of more a political purge than a systematic anti-Semitic policy. Would you argue that in 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, the Einsatzgruppen's policy definitely reorientated itself towards a systematical racial approach, or was it still a conception that basically the Bolsheviks and the Jews were more of a political enemy than a racial enemy?
Yeah, I mean, this is a place, I really like this question, because it's very often forgotten that there were Einsatzgruppen in Poland. I mean, there are, of course, some wonderful histories now, most of them written in the last 15 years or so, about September 1939 to December 1939 and the German killing policies in Poland. But I just wanted to note that in the if you just casually look at the historiography, you could get the impression that the Einsatzgruppen were created for the first time in 1941, right? Which is not true. They were Einsatzgruppen in Poland. There were even Einsatzgruppen in Czechoslovakia with slightly different kinds of tasks. So I want to say that it's both. So this is my interpretation, right? So my interpretation is that it's both political and racial, and that the interpretation of the political elite in Poland, the Nazi interpretation of the political elite in Poland was simply different than the Nazi interpretation of the political elite in the Soviet Union, which is interesting, right? Because it means that even the Nazis couldn't quite get themselves to think that Jews were in charge in Poland. Right? Like they treated the Polish political elite as being people who went to certain schools, as priests, as people who had as writers, as professors, as people who had served in certain state positions, as policemen, as army officers, as veterans of the Polish military organization, which the people who had taken part in that conflict over territory in Silesia, which was referred to in the previous question, 1919, they had a list, they had their ideas of who the Polish political class was. Interestingly, they were very bad, the Einsatzgruppen, they were very bad in Poland at tracking down the particular people they were trying to track down. They ended up killing tens of thousands of people, but not necessarily the precise people they meant to kill. But as you say, it was a political action. The idea was making sure that Poland could never rise again. In the Soviet Union, I think the definition of the state is just different. The definition of the state in the Nazi mind, it now includes Jews. And again, to be clear, it's not only Jews. When the Einsatzgruppen enter the Soviet Union, they're supposed to be killing party members, right? They're supposed to be killing other people, but in the list of the targets are Jews. And so I think there's consistency, because the idea in both cases is to destroy the state, not just to win a war, but to destroy the state. But I think the definition of the state in their minds is racial, which is why I can't answer your question quite the way that you ask it. I can't say that it's political or racial, because I think in their minds, in the Soviet Union, the political class was largely defined racially. That's how they saw it.
J'aimerais juste rajouter qu'il faut bien comprendre que les Einsatzgruppen sont des formations qui sont mobiles et qui ne sont pas permanentes. Ce sont des formations temporaires. En Pologne, ils existent 6 semaines et deviennent ensuite les bureaux locaux de la police et du SD. Et c'est la même chose en URSS, où les Einsatzgruppen sont sédentarisés à partir de l'hiver 1942, janvier-février 1942. En second lieu, ce qu'on voit, la différence, c'est qu'il y a une guerre qui est une guerre raciale, c'est la guerre en Union soviétique, ils appellent ça des grosse Rassenkrieg, la grande guerre raciale, ce qu'ils ne font pas pour la Pologne. Et il y a toute une différence de pratique entre les deux qui ressort à la fois de la brutalisation, mais aussi de modes de lecture radicalement différentes du conflit qui font que les Einsatzgruppen en Pologne ont une pratique qui est une pratique beaucoup plus d'élimination sociopolitique que d'élimination raciale. Le Tim l'a très bien expliqué. Voilà.
Merci à tous les deux. Donc, on va poser encore 2 questions car le temps file. Donc, la parole est à Emmanuel Glimet.
Merci. Je voulais poser une question à Timothy Snyder. Selon lui, quelle est l'explication pour cette rareté d'études historiques sur le pacte germano-soviétique aux États-Unis? En Russie, on comprend, en France, on peut comprendre aussi, pour des raisons politiques, mais aux États-Unis, pourquoi si peu d'études sur cette période 39-41?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, right? Because you would think, you know, the Americans carried out the Cold War for 45 years. The Americans produced studies of famine in Ukraine, of the Great Terror. You know, I find it puzzling myself, and I should say, I only realized this myself recently because I, of course, you know, I read. You know, there are books about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in German. There are books about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in Polish. There are books about the Molotov. There are document collections in Russian, important document collections. And so I read all that stuff, and it hadn't really occurred to me that there was no literature about it until I was in a debate with a colleague, and the colleague said, well, the historiography shows that that X, you know, and I thought, okay, what historiography is he talking about? And then I looked and I realized no one who has gone to an American graduate program in Russian history has ever written a book about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It's never happened. And I don't know why. I mean, I think part of it is that a lot of our historians of Russia don't know German. and a lot of our historians of German don't know Russian. But you know, and I think part of it is that, I mean, I don't want to push this point too far, but a lot of our Russian departments now take a kind of sympathetic perspective on Russian history. So I meet a lot of people who come through American graduate programs who are not very familiar with what I take are basic issues of Soviet history, like the famine in Ukraine or like the terror in the 1930s. But it's a wonderful question. You know, I just recently learned this myself, and I'm still myself kind of stunned by it. And I'm hoping that it will change, right? I mean, because as you say, the Russians can't do it now. The Russians can't do it. Fewer and fewer Poles know Russian, you know. It's a wonderful question. I wish I had a better answer.
Merci.
Merci à vous.
Alors, on va encore prendre vraiment deux questions. La première de Dominique Lanzmann et puis de Jean-Yves Potel. Donc, Dominique, mon micro est ouvert, oui. Dominique Lanzmann, on vous écoute.
Oui, bonjour, vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Merci pour ces exposés lumineux de Christian Ingrao et Timothy Snyder. Et je voulais juste vous soumettre une petite remarque simplement parce que j'ai entendu dire déjà pour ce qui est de la Shoah qui s'est passée en Union soviétique occidentale, parce qu'en France, on dit la Shoah. L'Holocauste a une connotation un peu sacrificielle et qui peut prêter à confusion. Donc, on dit la Shoah. Et donc, dans Shoah, dans le film de mon mari, puisque je le représente, il n'y a pas du tout cette Shoah de l'Union soviétique occidentale. Et j'ai déjà entendu des critiques à ce sujet. Et je voulais... Claude Lanzmann a essayé. Vous m'entendez?
Oui, c'est bon maintenant.
Oui, que Claude Lanzmann n'a pas obtenu le droit de filmer dans ce qui était à l'époque l'Union soviétique. En fait, c'est la raison pour laquelle il n'y a pas cela. Et d'autre part, le seul Einsatzgruppen qu'il a pu interviewer dans Shoah, c'était un certain Schubert qu'il a agressé. Je ne sais pas si vous connaissez l'histoire, il la raconte dans Le Lièvre de Patagonie. Donc, il n'a pas pu vraiment. C'est pour ça que je vous livre cette information. Je ne sais pas ce que ça vous fait, mais j'avais envie de le dire simplement, vous comprenez?
Merci.
Ce n'était pas une omission volontaire, c'est ça que je veux dire. Ni une omission par ignorance.
Est-ce que c'est une question?
Non, ce n'est pas une question, mais je veux bien que vous réagissiez quand même.
I mean, so what I would say respectfully is that Claude Lanzmann's project about at the time when he made those films, the whole idea of the Holocaust was not central the way that it is now. And I think the success of his film is making the concept of the Shoah inescapable in France and to a lesser extent elsewhere. I don't think the film ever claimed to be a total history of the Holocaust. And at the time when he was making it, no historians were saying the kinds of things that, you know, Christian Ingrao or Christoph Diekmann or Dieter Pohl or others would later say, right? At the time when Claude Lanzmann made Shoah, there wasn't this whole historiography of the Soviet Union. That didn't exist yet. It simply wasn't there. So I'm not surprised.
Alors, nous allons terminer avec une question donc, de Jean-Yves Potel.
Oui, ça va, vous m'entendez?
Très bien, Jean-Yves.
Bon, juste, c'était une remarque à propos du pacte germano-soviétique à la France, et je crois qu'effectivement, ça permet de faire le lien avec ce qui vient d'être dit. Je ne crois pas que le pacte germano-soviétique a été oublié en France. Il a été traité d'une autre manière. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a eu, dès le début des années 70-80, toute une polémique sur le pacte germano-soviétique par rapport à l'attitude du Parti communiste français en France vis-à-vis des Allemands et de l'occupant. Et donc, on a intériorisé le pacte germano-soviétique comme une sorte de trahison, c'est-à-dire les soviétiques qui étaient le grand frère du Parti communiste, et le Parti communiste était du côté de l'agresseur qui est l'allemand. Et donc je crois que ça renvoie aussi à la façon dont on a vu la Shoah à cette époque, effectivement, par rapport à tout ce qui a été dit, pour des tas de raisons objectives, mais on avait quand même une vision qui était centrée par rapport à l'Europe de l'Ouest. Et donc, le pacte germano-soviétique, en fait, n'était pas du tout conçu comme un lieu où on avait partagé la Pologne, les pays baltes, où on s'était mis d'accord sur la double agression. Ça, on n'en parlait jamais. On parlait de la trahison vis-à-vis de l'Union soviétique, vis-à-vis des Allemands, qui étaient notre agresseur. Ça, je crois que ça a beaucoup joué sur la façon dont on lit le pacte germano-soviétique en France.
Okay. I mean, that's very interesting. But I think that's really interesting because it shows how you can make almost any subject into a national debate. But it might be an example of a larger phenomenon, which is that in general we had an attitude about 1939 and 1940. At least early 1940, which was Drôle de Guerre, right? In English, phony war. That period from October 1939 to May of 1940 was a time when nothing is happening because nothing was happening, as it were, to us. And that idea of a Drôle de Guerre is also there so that we don't ask the question about why France didn't invade Germany, which is, for me, that's France. If France had invaded Germany, going back, if France had invaded Germany in September 1939, France would have won the war, right? But this whole notion of Drôle de Guerre is a way of somehow not looking east, but keeping our gaze westward. So I think there's also that larger phenomenon of thinking that the war was a war in Western Europe, and then somehow defining 1939, 1940 into an absence until May of 1940. And then in May of 1940, it's all about us. And then if you're British, in June of 1940, then it's all about us. And somehow that whole eastern part of Europe and all of those things that are happening in the Baltic states and Eastern Poland just gets overlooked. Christian, qu'est-ce que vous en pensez?
Je suis extrêmement d'accord avec vous, Tim, hein, sur cette question-là, sur la question du fait que, sur le fait que effectivement, les logiques nationales ont joué un rôle extrêmement important dans la façon dont s'agencent les historiographies. Et je vais profiter du fait que vous m'avez donné la parole pour vous rendre hommage, parce que vous faites partie, avec des gens comme Peter Lagroux, des personnes qui ont fait éclater un peu les barrières et les logiques nationales. Lui, en faisant de l'histoire comparative, vous, en traitant cette période, cet espace des Bloodlands comme en entier, et quelque chose qui, me semble-t-il, caractérise vraiment votre démarche, et de cela, on peut se féliciter. Je vous remercie encore donc de cette conférence que vous venez de donner et de ce plaidoyer que vous avez produit ici, un plaidoyer pour une histoire qui est à la fois ouverte, comme je viens de dire, en faisant éclater les logiques et les barrières nationales, mais une histoire aussi interactionniste, hein, qui montre bien comment les différentes pratiques des différents régimes se sont intriquées les unes aux autres, une histoire aussi historicisée. On ne peut pas bien comprendre ce qui se passe dans ces territoires occidentaux de l'Union soviétique si on ne comprend pas d'un côté les politiques publiques qui sont mises en place par la Grande Terreur et de l'autre la collectivisation et insérée dans le XXe siècle. On n'a pas eu le temps de parler de tout votre travail sur le temps présent, mais on sent bien tout ça. On vous remercie donc, Tim, beaucoup de tout ce que vous avez fait, tout ce que vous avez dit aujourd'hui. Et voilà, et messieurs, dames, je vous souhaite une bonne soirée.
Merci à tous. Merci à vous, Christian.
Au revoir. Au revoir, Timothy. À bientôt.
Merci Christian. Je vais garder la parole une toute petite minute avant qu'on raccroche, donc pour vous remercier tous les deux infiniment, donc au nom du Mémorial de la Shoah, et vous dire que donc ce cycle 1941 qui est brillamment introduit aujourd'hui avec nos deux historiens se poursuit ce dimanche 31 janvier avec donc deux tables rondes, une première centrée sur l'opération Barbarossa et la seconde qui va être centrée sur l'Ukraine et la Biélorussie avec Jean-Yves Potel qui a pris la parole, qui sera modérateur de cette deuxième table. Et je me permets aussi de vous dire très très vite qu'à défaut de pouvoir venir au Mémorial de la Shoah qui est fermé au public, une visite virtuelle du musée est en ligne depuis hier. Donc c'est un moyen comme un autre de visiter notre musée avant la réouverture de ses portes. Donc je vous souhaite à toutes et tous une très très bonne soirée. Et encore un grand merci à tous les deux. Et merci également aux traductrices et à Alexandre qui a assuré l'aspect technique de cette rencontre. À très bientôt. Au revoir, portez-vous bien.
Merci à tous.